Mhm. Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy. This, of course, is the City University of New York, McGarvis College. I am Professor Felix Obi, and today is Tuesday, February 18th, 2025. And in this week's Module 4 lecture, we will continue our discussion on the major institutions for managing world trade. As such, our learning objectives is such that by the conclusion of this week's assessment, you will be able to successfully address the following. First, explain the origins, rationale, and roles of post-World War II institutions that were established to manage global trade. One way to explain it would be to say that pre-World War II pre-World War II international organizations, such as the Bank of International Settlement (BIS), which was established in Basel, Switzerland, in 1930 to oversee the settlement of German reparations after World War I. Although its main purpose was to promote cooperation among central banks, it lacked institutional capacity and mandates to successfully address major economic and geopolitical challenges, such as the Great Depression, post-World War II reconstruction of Europe, conflict resolution, and rule-making institutions. Consequently, in July 1944, delegates from 44 countries convened in the Bretton Woods Conference, and within 22 days, they endorsed a framework for international economic cooperation after World War II. The rules-based international order, as we know it today, is predicated on a system of laws, rules, and norms, and it has underpinned international interactions since its formal establishment in 1945. Two international economic organizations resulted from the Bretton Woods Conference. First is the International Monetary Fund, otherwise known as the IMF, while the second is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which is now part of the World Bank Group. In 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade became the main global trade organization. Well, more like a trade agreement pretending to be an organization, quite frankly, in the strictest sense. The United Nations, which succeeded the League of Nations, was established after World War II, and its charter, which was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, California, took effect on October 24th, 1945. Now, this really, I want to go back for just a second and really highlight this, that the rules-based international order, as we know it today, is predicated on a system of laws, rules, and norms, and it has underpinned international interactions since its formal establishment in 1945. So as we go about having conversations, whether in this class and out of this class, I suspect the theme and the phrase rules-based international order would likely come up. So now you're beginning to understand some of the origins and some of the necessity for creating a rules-based international system that guides how nations interact and, crucially, a dispute resolution mechanism. So it's a set of laws, rules, and norms. So moving forward, the next learning objective is to describe the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. Of course, as I hope you now know, the IMF is the International Monetary Fund. So the IMF, or again, the International Monetary Fund, is regarded as the global lender of last resort to national governments and a leading supporter of exchange rate stability. So it is important to understand this last bit again, to highlight this, that IMF is regarded as the global lender of last resort. In practice, this means that IMF is where countries go to borrow when nobody else would lend to them. You have to imagine that however you manage your finances, if it comes to a point where nobody wants to lend to you, structural reforms must occur so that that country may regain the capacity to retire any kind of facility that it takes from the IMF. Consider what would happen to the world international financial system if countries just kept borrowing from the IMF without the capacity to repay. Then we would have to create a new IMF to bail out the IMF. So, and this is where most of the controversy with the IMF stems from, that it structural adjustment programs imposes hardship on countries who are reaching out to the IMF for facility. The reality of it is that countries who are reaching out to IMF for facility do need to undergo structural adjustment programs. Now, it is fair to say that sometimes the programs that IMF recommends are not, they tend to be cookie cutter, for lack of a better expression. And perhaps the bank, the fund can do better with tailoring its facilities to more successfully meet the peculiarities of the country that it is seeking to help fix its balance of trade. So it is stated, so the stated mission of the IMF is working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, promote higher employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world. The IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II. It now plays a central role in the management of balance of payments difficulties and international financial crisis. Through a quota system, countries contribute to the pool from which countries can borrow if they experience balance of payments problems. Again, as I discussed last week, very quickly, balance of payment is, just look at it as if a country is a net import of a country minus its net exports. So for a country to buy the things that it needs from other countries, it needs to sell something to earn foreign exchange that it can use to purchase those goods and services. But what if the country ends up selling less stuff than it needs to buy from the international market? Where does it get the money from to cover the balance of payment? This is where the IMF would come in, and this is where the IMF would also insist that a country needs to restructure and so that it can be better able to manage its economy and finances. And we will get into the nitty-gritty of this conversation in the weeks ahead. So the World Bank, on the other hand, is an international financial institution that provides loans and grants to governments and private institutions of low and middle income countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects. Its vision is to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. So to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet, I guess that last qualifier on a livable planet suggests that how countries grow can have profound consequences on the environment and therefore our ability to continue to thrive on Earth. The World Bank is a unique global partnership of 5 institutions working for sustainable solutions that reduce poverty and build shared prosperity in developing countries. In 1995, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which is GAAP, was superseded by the World Trade Organization, or WTO. The GATT, though largely successful in its goal lacked a coherent institutional structure. In short, as I mentioned, it is a legal agreement acting as an international organization. The World Trade Organization, WTO, incorporates the principles of the GATT and is better positioned to carry them out because, among other things, it is better versed on issues like intellectual property, um, and has a faster dispute settlement system and wields more power. So these are some of the advantages of a WTO over GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Significantly, WTO rules are applicable to services and aspects of intellectual property, along with goods, which of course GATT covered. The other global institution that is part of the international order is the United Nations, which succeeded the League of Nations and was established after World War II, and its charter was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, California. The United Nations took effect on October 24, 1925, with the aim of preventing future world wars. The UN is an intergovernmental organization whose stated purpose are to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation, and serve as a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It is the world's largest international organization. It is important to note, though, that just how the UN is structured. So obviously there are several UN agencies such as the UNDP, United Nations, which has overview over development. There is UNICEF, and there are a host of other UN agencies. However, within the bureaucracy of the UN, there are two main bodies. There is the Security Council and the General Assembly. The Security Council resolutions from the Security Council are binding. And resolutions from the General Assembly aren't, while they are not binding as resolutions from the Security Council, they carry moral authority and weight. Now, the Security Council has 5 permanent members and a rotating cast of members who cycle in and out, member countries who cycle in and out of the Security Council. The 5 permanent member countries of the Security Council include the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And this is really part of the problem, or part of the challenge of the United Nations, at least until now, that international alliances appear to be going through a churn. Generally speaking, there is broad alliance, close alliance between positions of the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. And there is also broad alliance between international positions from the Republic of China from China and Russia. This often, just to clarify, Republic of China it's Taiwan, and that's not China as we mean it here. China that we mean it here is the PRC, People's Republic of China. Republic of China is ROC, is Taiwan. So anyways, and this cleavage between NATO countries on the one hand and China, Russia on the other often creates a stalemate at the Security Council because each of the 5 permanent member countries can veto a resolution. So if you were to try to advance an issue that is unhelpful, for instance, to the interests of NATO countries, it is likely that either France, United States, or United Kingdom will veto that resolution. The same is true if you wanted to advance any agenda that is of interest, that runs against the interest of, say, the alliances under China and Russia. This often creates a gridlock where an argument can be made that the Security Council is not as effective in addressing global challenges as it could be. And most of the time, the moral authority has fallen on the General Assembly, where all nations can vote. And by virtue of that vote, could lend legitimacy to an issue, an agenda, or persons, or delegitimize an issue, an agenda, or persons, or especially their actions. So most especially where most of the moral voice of the United Nations is coming from now can be argued to say to be out of the General Assembly. So the other learning outcomes is that you will also be able to respond to these questions. How does the IMF achieve its goals? So this is how we begin to take a slice and get just slightly, dip our toes a little bit into the functions of these institutions. So the IMF achieves its goals of fostering international financial stability by offering three distinct but complementary services. The first is policy advice. To maintain stability and prevent crises in the international monetary system, the IMF keeps a regular policy dialogue with governments of its member countries. It assesses economic conditions and recommends policies that enable sustainable growth. The IMF also monitors regional, global, economic, and financial developments. The second is financial assistance. The IMF provides loans and concessional financial assistance to member countries experiencing actual or potential balance of payment problems. This is a core responsibility of the IMF. And just for clarity, concessional financial assistance means that the point on the facility that IMF is granting the country is below market rate. That is, the interest, should there be one, and most cases there are, would be less than what that country would have had any right to expect in the open market. The third critical work that the IMF does is capacity development. The IMF provides capacity development, which is technical assistance and training of government officials to help member countries strengthen economic institutions and statistics, as well as capacities in areas such as taxation and administration, expenditure management, monetary and exchange rate policy, financial system supervision and regulation, and legislative frameworks. The second is to know why is the IMF, to understand why the IMF is controversial, and I've touched on this ever so briefly. So since the collapse of the fixed exchange rate in 1973, the International Monetary Fund has taken a more active role in fostering financial stability, especially in developing countries. Some critics say the conditions the IMF attaches to its loans are too harsh and have harmed developing countries. With respect to conditionalities of credit facilities, the IMF makes the loan conditional on the implementation of certain economic policies. These policies tend to involve A, reducing government borrowing, higher taxes, and lower spending. B, higher interest rates to stabilize the currency. C, allowing failing firms to go bankrupt. D, structural adjustment, privatization, deregulation, reducing corruption, and bureaucracy. The problem is that these policies of structural adjustment and macroeconomic intervention can make difficult economic situations worse, at least in the short run. And therefore, the often heard complaints that the IMF facilities worsen poverty. Another significant controversy is that the IMF does not sufficiently understand the dynamics of the country that they work with, insisting instead on blanket reforms. And this is the cookie cutter charges that I had briefly touched on earlier. Others, such as Joseph Stieglitzer, argue that while the IMF does, that argues that while what the IMF does was not participating in a conspiracy to further undermine indebted countries, but it was reflecting the interest and ideology of Western community. Yet another criticism is on IMF's neoliberal policies, such as privatization. Critics argue that free market policies are not always suitable for situations of fragile countries with weak institutions. For example, privatization can lead to creation of private monopolies who exploit consumers, as well as being criticized for implementing free market reforms. Others criticize the IMF for being too interventionist. Believers in free market argue that it is better to let capital markets operate without attempts at intervention. They argue that attempts to influence exchange rates only make things worse, suggesting that it is better to allow currencies to reach their market level. Others further suggest that bailing out countries with large debt creates moral hazard. Because of the possibility of getting bailed out, it encourages countries to borrow, or borrow even more. The IMF has also been criticized for imposing policy with little or no consultation with the affected countries. So a number of challenges here. First of all, let me quickly remind the class, and I think I had mentioned this in a previous class, a few times in previous classes, that as we go through this semester, there are going to be words and phrases that I'm going to ask you to write down. I'm going to ask you to have a technical understanding of what the words and phrases mean and try to work them into your logic and most certainly into your conversations. And one of those phrases is moral hazard, which essentially means that facilities that are intended to bail people out from challenging situations could actually become a disincentive to make frugal decisions. One of the easiest way to understand this, for instance, is say you are a stamp collector and you value your stamps. Obviously, you're probably going to get a safe and lock that stamp and lock up the stamp and make sure that nobody steals, robs, or nicks your stamps. But what if, and to the extent that you buy a safe and you put your stamps in the safe, you are actually safeguarding your investment and you're making it less likely that you're going to incur a loss. But what if you were to buy insurance and the insurance policy says that if you lose the stamp, well, we'll just make you whole, either cash or we'll get you new stamps. You can see how this can become a disincentive for the stamp collector to safeguard their stamps. Because why did they bother? Because, if they lose the stamp, the insurance policy would cover them and make them whole. This is what moral hazard is. So the idea in this case is that if the IMF were to just make countries whole, there will be little incentive for those countries to change their behavior. The behavior that, by the way, had them end up needing to apply for facilities from the IMF. That said, of course, the failure of the IMF tends to be widely publicized, but it's also helpful to note that its successes tend to be less so. Also, criticism tends to focus on short-term problems and ignores the longer-term view. IMF loans have helped many countries avoid liquidity crises. Crucially, the fact that there is a lender of last resort provides an important confidence boost for investors. This is important, especially during financial turmoil. IMF can be an easy target. Sometimes countries may need to undertake painful short-term macroeconomic adjustments, but there would be a lack of political will. An IMF intervention in cases like this enables the government to secure a loan and then pass the blame onto the IMF for the difficulties. Realize that countries are not obligated to take an IMF loan. It is indeed countries who approach the IMF for a loan. The fact so many countries take IMF loans suggests that there must be at least some benefits of the IMF. So again, as I emphasized earlier, the phrase for the week is moral hazard. The concept, again, is that individuals or institutions are disincentivized to alter their behavior when cost of their risk or bad decision making is borne by others. So in closing, permit me to conclude by foreshadowing next week's lecture, which will be on the liberal perspective in international political economy. And I really look forward to next week's lecture because the liberal perspective is at the heart of many of the dialogue, I should put it that way, that is ongoing in the global institutions and in interactions between countries. So I look forward to next week's lecture. And with that, I will turn off the recording and take questions as appropriate. Thank you.